What if the most powerful tax you pay has no bill, no vote, and no escape? It creeps through grocery aisles, surges at the gas pump, and silently rearranges your future. You feel it before you understand it, long after it's done its work. The word is simple, inflation, but the scheme is anything but. It is money's quiet betrayal, and throughout history, it has moved power from pockets to palaces. You're watching Hidden Finance, the place where we unravel the systems, stories, and secrets behind the numbers that shape your life. Here, we go beyond the headlines to decode how money really works and who really benefits. Today, we open a vault most would rather keep sealed: how and why inflation remains one of the oldest tools of state power. This isn't a conspiracy. This is incentives, institutions, and the architecture of control. Stay with us, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Inflation begins with a choice. When a government wants more than it can politically raise in taxes or plausibly borrow from markets, it has three doors: taxation, debt, and the printing press. Taxes are visible, people protest. Borrowing is harder when investors demand higher interest to lend to a prodigal state. But the printing press, whether physical or digital, whether done by a mint or a central bank, feels painless at first until the bill arrives in the price of everything. Economists call it the inflation tax, the way new money erodes the value of your existing money without a lawmaker ever voting for it. Debtors benefit, savers lose. And the biggest debtor in most economies is the government itself, with obligations to pay pensions, bondholders, and promises as far as the eye can see. Inflation makes those promises cheaper in real terms. Nominal numbers stay the same while the true cost melts away. Hidden in plain sight is another trick. As paychecks rise in nominal terms, tax brackets and benefits often lag, a phenomenon called bracket creep. Revenue rises, and you pay more, even if you're not truly better off. This is not a modern invention. The Roman Empire perfected it with metal instead of paper. As the empire's costs soared, emperors diluted the silver content of coins like the denarius. Soldiers still saw coins stamped with familiar images, but beneath the image, the metal was cheaper. Prices climbed, trust weakened, and by the time Emperor Diocletian tried to freeze prices by decree, the economy had already slipped into a maze of scarcity, black markets, and a widening gap between the state's grandeur and the people's reality. Medieval Europe repeated the play with its own flourish. In the early 1600s, the Holy Roman Empire suffered the Kipper and Whipper crisis, a storm of coin clipping and debasement so chaotic that entire cities rigged scales to cheat one another. Governments blamed speculators, but officials themselves had melted coins and reissued them with lower purity to stretch revenues. The result? A collapse in trust that choked trade and upended daily life. Only when authorities reminted coins at honest weights did stability return, and the memory of the scam lingered for generations. France tried a more modern version in the early 1700s. John Law, a Scottish banker with big ideas, persuaded the crown to replace metal with paper, promising growth and liquidity. His Banque Generale financed a bubble in colonial dreams, the Mississippi Company, fueling a fever of speculation funded by easy money. When confidence cracked, the currency collapsed, fortunes evaporated, and paper money became synonymous with ruin. The monarchy's credibility eroded, setting a precedent. Overissued money can jumpstart growth, but it can also torch a state's legitimacy. The French Revolution tried again with a rational veneer. Assignats, paper notes backed by confiscated church lands, were meant to be honest and finite. But when war and revolution demanded more funding, the printing presses ran nonstop. Prices surged, goods hid in the shadows, and officials imposed maximum prices by force. Hyperinflation arrived not as an accident, but as a decision repeated too many times, ending only when the notes became worthless. The economy fractured, and a new ruler promised stability by tightening money again. Across the Atlantic, the United States reached for its own inflation lever during the Civil War. Unable to cover the Union's enormous costs, Congress issued greenbacks, unbacked paper currency that pushed prices high. About 80% inflation in the North. In the Confederacy, where printing ran unchecked, inflation turned into a collapse. After the war, politics revolved around one hard question. Should the dollar return to gold, squeezing debtors and farmers, or should easier money prevail? The eventual return to gold restored credibility but left scars. Inflation helped win a war but threatened to unspool the social contract that followed. World War I was a turning point for the global monetary order. Most combatants abandoned the gold standard, promising to return later, and financed war with debt and money creation. Germany, burdened by reparations and internal political turmoil, ran the presses until money lost meaning altogether. In 1923, Weimar Germany, wages were paid twice a day as prices doubled by the hour. Debtors and asset owners survived. Pensioners and the middle class watched lifetimes of savings evaporate. The lesson was brutal. When a state falsifies its money, it falsifies social order. The 1930s brought the opposite: deflation, depression, and fear. Yet even here, policy wielded inflation to shift power. In 1933, the United States broke with the gold constraint at home. Americans were ordered to turn in their gold at a fixed price. Soon after, the government raised the official gold price from $20.67 to $35 an ounce, devaluing the dollar by about 41% against gold. It was a transfer, legal, sweeping, and sudden, that pushed prices higher and debts easier to bear. It was also a reminder the value of money is a policy choice, not a law of nature. During World War II, the machinery became more sophisticated. The U.S. Federal Reserve capped interest rates to keep government borrowing cheap, while rationing and price controls tried to corral the inevitable inflation. Citizens were urged to buy war bonds, but the true cost was paid afterward. Double-digit inflation in 1946, 1948, and negative real rates that quietly shrank government debt. By 1951, the famous Treasury-Fed Accord restored central bank independence, on paper. But the lesson had sunk in. With enough political will, a government can command low nominal yields and let inflation do the heavy lifting. Then came the architecture that would define a generation. Bretton Woods. Currencies were pegged to the dollar was pegged to gold. But the math never reconciled with reality. By the 1960s, the US ran deficits for war and welfare, while other countries demanded gold for their swelling dollar claims. The London Gold Pool, central bank's joint effort to hold gold at $35, broke in 1968. In August 1971, President Nixon said the gold window was temporarily closed. In truth, the link was severed forever. Wages and prices were frozen by decree, but the dam had broken, and inflation gathered force. The 1970s were a masterclass in how inflation can damage trust and reorder power. Oil shocks in 1973 and 1979 drove energy prices skyward, but underneath lay years of monetary slippage and political convenience. Prices rose, wages chased prices, and productivity stagnated. Inflation in the United States pushed near 14%. In the United Kingdom, it shot over 20% mid-decade. The public learned a painful paradox. The more the state tried to fix prices and guide outcomes, the more the system lurched, and the easier it became to opt for inflation rather than discipline. And then, another turning point, Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, and he chose pain over decay. Interest rates were allowed to soar above 20%, unemployment rose, and a deep recession crushed demand. But the currency's anchor was reset, expectations changed, inflation fell, and the idea of central bank independence hardened into orthodoxy. Around the world, countries embraced inflation targeting, disciplined budgets, and a faith that technocrats could manage money better than politicians. The great moderation of the 1990s and early 2000s followed. Steady growth, low inflation, and a belief that the dragon had been slain. But outside the developed world, inflation remained a tool of necessity and power. In Latin America from the 1970s through the 1990s, governments repeatedly turned to the printing press to cover deficits. Brazil cycled through currencies as annual inflation blew past 2,000% by 1993. Argentina saw prices rise by thousands of percent in 1989 before a temporary fix tied the peso to the dollar. The pattern was familiar. The wealthy hedged in dollars and real estate. The poor held local money and paid the inflation tax. Each stabilization brought hope. Each relapse proved how hard it is to give up a tool that wins short-term relief. In the 2000s, Zimbabwe marked the extreme end of this path. After land seizures, tanked productivity, and fiscal judgment collapsed, the government printed money until trillion-dollar notes bought a loaf of bread. Citizens fled to dollars and barter, and the national currency effectively died. A decade later, Venezuela repeated the cycle as oil revenue fell and deficits were monetized. Hyperinflation is more than a number. It's a form of social amnesia, a wiping out of contracts, savings, and faith that tomorrow will resemble today. When inflation becomes a last resort, the state keeps its power while the people lose their future. Then came a subtler era of statecraft, no flames, only fog. After the global financial crisis of 2008, central banks created money on a scale once unthinkable, buying bonds to prevent collapse. Consumer prices stayed tame for a while, but asset prices surged. Stocks, homes, and bonds inflated as near-zero rates pushed investors up the risk ladder. Economists call it the Cantillon effect. Those nearest the newly created money benefit first. Financial markets boomed, wages and savings accounts lagged. It felt like prosperity but widened the gulf between capital and labor. The 2020s pandemic fused fiscal and monetary policy like a weld. Governments spent at wartime levels and central banks absorbed the bonds to keep borrowing cheap. Supply chains snapped, demand roared back. And by 2021-2022, inflation broke into the open with 4-decade highs across advanced economies. Real wages fell for many, household budgets trembled, staples felt remote. Governments collected more as nominal incomes and prices rose, while many tax thresholds waited to catch up. And behind the scenes, a new phrase returned to the forefront: fiscal dominance. The idea that central banks must accommodate a government's financing needs, whether they like it or not. In that fog, an old playbook reemerged: financial repression. Interest rates are held below inflation, either explicitly or by guidance, regulation, and the pressure of stability. Savers accept returns that lose ground to rising prices. Governments refinance cheaply. Debt melts in real terms. Some countries openly cap long-term yields, as Japan did for years. Others encourage banks, pensions, and insurers to hold government bonds, creating a captive audience. The mechanism is elegant and brutal. No law takes your money, yet it goes missing. There are other tricks in the toolkit, each shifting power quietly. Price controls can hide inflation temporarily by forbidding prices to rise, but shortages and black markets are the usual sequel. Shrinkflation masks price increases by shrinking the product and keeping the sticker the same, a private sector response to a public pressure. Indexation helps some, like pensions tied to inflation. Once, but not all, thresholds, taxes, and benefits are updated equally or promptly. When the numbers change, the hierarchy of who wins and who loses changes too. The human consequences are not theoretical. Inflation redistributes from older savers to younger debtors, from wage earners to asset holders, from the cautious to the leveraged. It encourages spending now and punishes patience. It tilts political power by making today's promises cheap and tomorrow's obligations someone else's problem. And it corrodes trust in prices and contracts, and the simple idea that a unit of work will buy a unit of life. When trust breaks, people seek anchors elsewhere: gold, dollars, real estate, or more recently, digital assets. But here is the difficult truth. Not all inflation is a plot, and not every government desires it. Sometimes it's a policy error, a shock, or a desperate response to crisis. Yet the incentives remain, steady as a drumbeat. Inflation reduces the real weight of debt, raises nominal tax revenue, and avoids the pain of visible austerity. Politicians live by election cycles. Inflation works on calendars too. The temptation in hard times is always to inflate first and explain later. So what can we learn and what can we watch? Watch debt levels, not just the headline figure, but who holds it and at what maturity. Watch whether central banks are truly independent, or whether they are gently conscripted into funding governments through bond purchases and guidance. Watch the gap between inflation and interest rates. Negative real rates are a tax by another name. And watch the indexation of your world: wages, tax brackets, benefits, rents, and savings. Because inflation is less about the number the news quotes and more about the terms of your own life. The pattern across centuries is sobering. Debasement, paper issuance, and controlled interest rates are not random emergencies. They are recurring instruments. In moderation, inflation can grease the gears of a complex economy. In excess, it sets them on fire. The line between the two is drawn not by formulas alone, but by institutions. By credibility, transparency, and an honest accounting of who pays for what. When those falter, inflation does not just raise prices, it rewrites society. Today's world sits at another crossroads. Global debts are high, demographics are shifting, and the politics of sacrifice are fragile. The easiest path is visible: borrow more, hold rates down, and let inflation quietly do the work. The harder path asks for trade-offs, discipline, and truth-telling, the things that make democracies healthy, but campaigns difficult. History suggests which path is chosen when pressure rises. Inflation is a policy, not just a number; a narrative, not just a statistic. It can be humane in small doses and barbaric in excess. It can keep a government afloat while its citizens tread water. And if you don't understand it, you pay for it twice. Once at the checkout, and again in the future you no longer get to have. Keep your eyes on the forces behind the figures, not just the figures themselves. Because this is hidden finance. The story of inflation is the story of power, and it's written in your wallet.